Today is Memorial Day. It's actually a coincidence that this year Memorial Day lands on May 30th. From 1868 to 1970, Memorial Day was officially recognized to be May 30th, but since 1971, it's been recognized as the last Monday in May. It is a day of remembrance. According to the United States Department of Veteran Affairs, the day commemorates those men and women who have died in the nation's service. Among those was Captain Eddie Grant of the 307th Infantry Regiment. Captain Grant's is just one story that reminds us why we commemorate Memorial Day. One story of the millions who have given their lives in this nation's service, who deserve to be remembered.
It was October 1918, and the attention of the people of the United States was on the Argonne Forest and the men of the Lost Battalion. The Meuse-Argonne offensive was part of the massive Allied 100 Days offensive, intended to be the final offensive to end the Great War. The Meuse-Argonne sector was largely the responsibility of the Americans, whose strength added to the Allies was seen as key to the final defeat of Germany. The offensive eventually included some 1.2 million Americans. By some measures, it was the largest and deadliest battle in the history of the United States military. The importance of the battle was well understood by the largely untested American Expeditionary Force. The standing order was simple. Ground, once captured, must under no circumstances be given up. The saga of the Lost Battalion began the morning of October 2nd. Some 545 men of the 77th Infantry Division were tasked with taking Hill 198. They took the hill in a day of hard fighting, but the units on both flanks were hit by strong counterattacks and driven back. The group was surrounded. Despite the name, in fact, the Lost Battalion was not a single battalion, but 9 companies of the 154th Infantry Brigade of the 77th Infantry Division, representing parts of 4 different battalions. The 77th Infantry Division had originally consisted of draftees, mostly from New York City. Its shoulder sleeve insignia showed the Statue of Liberty, and it was thus called the Liberty Division, or the Metropolitan Division. The senior commander of the 9 companies was Major Charles Whittlesey, a Harvard-trained lawyer and commander of the 1st Battalion of the 308th Infantry Regiment. In reality, the Lost Battalion was never lost. Whittlesey knew their position throughout. It was the rest of the Allied armies that didn't know where they were. While itself a small part of the offensive, the saga of the Lost Battalion was very important to the Allies, and particularly to the men of the American Expeditionary Force. Rescuing the battalion would mean a significant achievement, demonstrating that the American Army was the match of its more experienced allies. Whereas, if the battalion were to be forced to surrender, it could undermine Allied faith in the Americans. Both sides knew the score. The Americans made repeated attacks, trying to relieve the battalion. The Germans desperately opposed those attempts while employing some of its best troops, including an elite battalion of stormtroopers, trying to force the battalion to surrender. It was a desperate fight. The 308th Infantry Regiment alone lost 766 men in attempts to reach Whittlesey's force. The attack captivated the nation, and the force held until it was relieved on October 7th after being encircled for 5 days. For the Americans, it was one of the most famous events of the war. But the story that is familiar is only partially told. The Boston Post opined in November 1918. When the now famous beleaguered Lost Battalion was surrounded in the trackless jungle of the Argonne, not a morning nor an afternoon passed without its fierce, devoted attempt by a brother regiment to cut its way through the encircling Germans. An unending succession of assaults, which finally, and just in time, brought up the delayed relief. Yet, as with other historic sieges, the spotlight of history hovers now, and will always hover over the people besieged. It leaves in the half-shadow the forces marching to the relief, and probably never will be written the full story of the sacrifice and endurance which made that relief possible. How again and again the attempt was made to find a weak place in the German grip on the ravine. How the Americans fought through swamps and up steep hills, made impossible by scores of invisible machine guns. That is the story. Whittlesey himself knew the sacrifices made on behalf of his men. The Post continues. When several days later the scribes of the battle made their way to that ravine where Major Whittlesey, commander of the beleaguered battalion, was camped, he met them with words that ran something like this: "The real story is not here. The real story is with the men who day and night fought their way to our relief."
Among those was another Harvard-educated New York City lawyer by the name of Edward Leslie Grant.
Eddie Grant was born May 21st, 1883, in Franklin, Massachusetts. He attended Harvard University, where he played on both the baseball and the basketball team. He graduated with his undergraduate degree in '05, but continued at Harvard to study law. He got his Major League Baseball start shortly after his 1905 graduation. Slugger Nap Lachue was such a star player for Cleveland's Major League team that the team was literally named for him, the Cleveland Naps. But he suffered an ankle injury towards the end of the 1905 season, and Eddie Grant was brought on board as an emergency replacement. Grant would end up playing 990 games in the major leagues with Cleveland, Philadelphia, Cincinnati, and the New York Giants. Over that period, he finished his law degree at Harvard in 1909. In the off-season, he would practice law in New York and Boston. Grant was a solid player, and during his best years playing second base in Philadelphia, he was a fan favorite and a standout. The St. Louis Star and Times noted he was the most dangerous man on the Phillies, and he held the reputation for years. In one streak in 1909, he hit 7 straight plate appearances in a single day in a doubleheader against the New York Giants. That record wasn't beaten until 1952, and not beaten in the National League until 1992. He was also a good fielder, excelled at stealing bases. The Los Angeles Evening Express wrote he was the sort of chap that never gave up, no matter how big the odds were against his side.
But his contribution to baseball was in more than his play.
Because of his education, he was called Harvard Grant. His education made for his notable eccentricity. When calling a fly ball, instead of shouting the common, "I got it," he used the more grammatically correct, "I have it." His education had meaning in the early years of professional baseball. The Star and Times wrote, Eddie Grant was a credit to the national game he helped so much to uplift. He was among the first of the college boys to take up professional baseball, and it was their entrance into the game that raised the standard of the sport. The newspaper goes on, at the time that Eddie decided to become a professional player, baseball was not in very high repute. Grant would help to change that image. The Evening Express wrote, as is characteristic of college-bred athletes, he was, first of all, a gentleman. The Star and Times opined, the example set by Grant and the other collegians changed the sentiment towards the game and lifted the game to its present level. The benefits that have accrued to baseball by the entrance into it of Eddie Grant and his fellows are inestimable.
He might not have been the flashiest player. In fact, you might never have heard his name, and yet Eddie Grant deserves as much credit as anyone for making baseball America's pastime.
But maybe just as important, he was simply a good fellow. He was known for being a friend to rookies, helping younger players. He played unselfishly, and the Star and Times noted, never in his life had Eddie Grant anything but a good word to say about anyone. The Evening Express wrote, without a doubt, Grant was one of the most modest chaps that ever played baseball. While his hitting faded and his batting average decreased, he continued to be a well-regarded fielder, playing shortstop in Cincinnati, and then in 1913 was traded to the Giants. His career was towards its end, but he made appearances as a pinch hitter and pinch runner in the 1913 World Series. In 1915, he retired from baseball and dedicated his time to his practice of law. When the U.S. entered the Great War in 1917, Eddie Grant was 35 years old, too old to be drafted. He easily could have sat out the war, as many other baseball players chose, served working in home industry, a so-called shipyard job. But that was not how Harvard Eddie lived his life. The Washington Post wrote, to a man of Eddie Grant's type, there was only one thing to do when war was declared, and that was to get into action. There would have been no shipyard job for Eddie. Grant decided to train to be an officer, attending the same Plattsburgh training camp that Charles Whittlesey and fellow Harvard Law School graduate Theodore Roosevelt Jr. did. The website of the New York Giants Preservation Society quotes a letter he wrote to a friend. I'm going to try to be an officer. I don't know how much of a success I shall make of it. The sort of chap who never gave up was confident of victory. He wrote his sister, the Germans won't be able to win a game from us. We would knock old Hindenburg out of the box in the first inning. Grant was commissioned a captain of Company H of the 307th Infantry Battalion of the 77th Infantry Division. A company of his battalion, Company K, was among the 9 companies besieged with Whittlesey. Harvard Eddie was the same gentleman fighter at war that he had been on the baseball diamond. The Boston Post wrote, the men of Company H testify that they never went into action without their captain in the lead, and one of them, he used to be a traffic policeman on duty at the Polo Grounds in New York, says that to the onlooker there never was any difference between the Captain Grant who walked forward, smiling and unconcerned under shell fire, and the Eddie Grant of old, trotting up from the bench to third base. Army Chaplain Henry Wacker wrote of him, Captain Grant was the most popular man in the 307th Infantry, well beloved by his men who would follow him wherever he led the way. He had no fear of death, going where duty and honor called him. Company H was involved in the bloody operation to rescue the Lost Battalion from the start. By the third day of the siege, Company H had been in continuous combat for nearly 4 straight days. Like his men, the stalwart captain was exhausted. In fact, Grant's men had attempted to send the captain back to an aid station to rest. The Post writes, they had seen by his white, drawn face how utterly he was exhausted. They had watched while he started several times to drink his coffee and then let the cup stand, literally too weary to lift it to his lips. They had tried to persuade him to go back to the aid station and rest even for a little time, but he paid no heed to them. Lieutenant Lloyd Neese wrote in a letter to Grant's father, I saw him only 5 minutes before the attack and insisted that he go to the hospital as he was suffering from bronchitis and was very hoarse. But he refused and said, when we get relieved, we'll go. The 307th suffered greatly in the attempts to relieve the Lost Battalion. The Post continues, his company, which had been in the thick of the fighting on the Vesle River, which had had a part in every attempt to relieve the boys of the Lost Battalion, was moving forward for the 6th attack when the wounded major, being carried past on a litter, directed Captain Grant to take command. The Scranton Tribune explained, on the way through the forest, fighting at every step, Grant came upon stretcher bearers carrying back the major commanding the battalion who had been wounded. The major called to Grant, take command of the battalion. Eddie Grant was one of the few officers left. Now in acting command of the 3rd Battalion of the 307th Infantry Regiment, Grant did what he had always done. He led. The Germans were determined to beat back the assault, and their artillery rained down on the men of the 307th. A shell exploded, injuring 2 lieutenants, one of them Grant's adjutant. He yelled for his men to get down, to take cover, but he himself remained standing, calling for a stretcher for his fallen adjutant, when a second shell exploded. The Scranton Tribune wrote, he was calling and waving his hands when the shell struck him. It was a direct hit. Grant's body is buried in the Argonne Forest, a few yards from where he fell. His final resting place is marked by a pile of stones and a rude cross. Lieutenant Neese wrote, his death was a great loss to the division. I personally looked after his burial and had some sod put around his grave, the best I could do under the circumstances. He is buried in a beautiful place. The Post reported in the course of those attacks many officers and men were killed or wounded. In leading one of them, Captain Grant of H Company, 307th Infantry, was struck dead at the head of the battalion. This was Eddie Grant of the Giants, Eddie Grant of the Philadelphia Nationals, Eddie Grant for the old Cincinnati Reds. He was one of the players whom baseball knew no more after the first call to arms was sounded across America. The Los Angeles Evening Express wrote, Grant didn't wait to be drafted. He enlisted as soon as we entered the war. He was the first baseball player to die for Uncle Sam. The Washington Post wrote, the umpire supreme over all has called its last strike on Eddie Grant. He was a fighter to the last ditch, was Eddie Grant. He was the highest type of baseball player, and he was the real type of an officer and gentleman. Baseball gave of its best in Captain Grant, and now he has given up his life for one of the greatest causes for which man ever fought. Baseball fans are justly proud of Eddie Grant. His passing is mourned by all who knew him.
Almost as soon as Grant's death was reported, there were calls to have a memorial built at the Polo Grounds, the stadium where the Giants played. Harry Elwood Moose McCormick, a future Hall of Famer who had also served in France as a captain with the 167th Infantry Regiment, sent a telegram to fellow professional baseball player Sam Crane. Suggest suitable memorial for Eddie Grant's biggest sacrifice.
The honor came on Memorial Day, May 30th, 1921, 101 years ago today. The New York Giants Preservation Society notes, within weeks of the news of Grant's death, new reports told of a campaign to honor the fallen ballplayer with a memorial to be located at the Polo Grounds, the last place he called home as a big leaguer. By February 1919, the Edward L. Grant Memorial Association was formed, led by baseball executives, players, military officers, and sports writers. Its purpose to erect a lasting and suitable edifice to the former infielder. Between games of a Giants doubleheader against the visiting Phillies, the Grant Monument was unveiled, with 30,000 watching from the Polo Ground stands. A flag was removed by one of Grant's sisters, Florence Grant Robson, revealing the monument, its inscription highlighted by the line, Soldier, Scholar, Athlete. The Giants played their last game at the Polo Grounds in September of 1957, before moving to San Francisco. According to the New York Times, apparently after the game, Giants fans pillaged their team's former field, and the plaque disappeared. While there were reports that the plaque had been recovered by police, and even reports in 1997 that it had been recovered from the basement of a former police officer's home, The original plaque has never been found.
Eddie Harvard Grant, who played such an important role in early baseball and gave all for his country, is mostly forgotten today. And yet his story is one of millions that deserves to be remembered this Memorial Day. Dulce et decorum est pro patra mori. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy. Check out our community on thehistoryguideguild.locals.com, our webpage at thehistoryguy.com, and our merchandise at teespring.com, or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you have to do is subscribe.